We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up, Moldova celebrates its Independence Day, but is the Russian bear looming large once again? We'll hear why Australia has hit the diplomatic nuclear button with Iran.
These were extraordinary and dangerous acts of aggression orchestrated by a foreign nation on Australian soil.
And why the EU is standing its ground over regulation of digital services.
It is the sovereign right of the EU and its member states to regulate economic activities on our territory, which are consistent with our democratic values.
Plus a roundup of the latest aviation news, and we'll leaf through the day's papers too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Donald Trump's steep 50% tariffs on India have kicked in, making the American ally among the countries paying the highest tariffs in the world. SpaceX has pulled off a successful 60-minute test flight of its newest generation rocket Starship, reversing a trend of disappointing failures. And the animated musical K-pop Demon Hunters has climbed up Netflix's chart to become its most viewed movie ever. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories, but first, Moldova is marking its Independence Day today, 34 years since it broke away from the Soviet Union in 1991. But the path hasn't always been smooth. Just months after independence, the eastern region of Transnistria tried to secede, backed by Russian speakers and Moscow. A short war in 1992 left Russian troops stationed there, and ever since the conflict has remained frozen. Today, in a pointed signal to Russia, France's President Macron, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk are visiting for the celebrations. But should Europe be worried that this territorial dispute could flare up once again? To discuss this, we're joined now from the capital, Chisinau, by Paula Erizanu, a Moldovan-Romanian journalist. Paula, firstly, tell us a bit more about these annual celebrations. What do they involve?
Yes, sure. So every year there is the official part where we have the kind of orchestras and the soldiers all dressed up and the leaders of state going and doing their ceremonies. And then in the evening, usually, and even during the day, there are celebrations, concerts with local and international artists. And yes, last year we had the leaders of the Baltic states coming in, and this year we have Western European leaders joining President Maia Sandu on stage in the evening for this concert in the National Assembly Square in Chisinau. But meanwhile, there are other activities all over the country.
And what message do you think this notable visit by Macron, Scholz and Tusk is sending both to Russia and to Moldovans?
It's a message of solidarity, and we do have parliamentary elections coming up on 28th of September, so in a month's time. And on that day, Moldovans will basically have to choose between continuing with the European integration path that the party in power, PAS, and its founder, Maia Sandu, have set for the past 4 or 5 years, and other kinds of politicians, a lot of them representing the Kremlin's interests or having ties to the Kremlin or with the former oligarchic class that ruled Moldova.
Well, Moldova is a membership candidate for the EU. How close is it? And what would it mean joining?
So both European and national leaders have said that Moldova could join the EU by 2030, if not before, by like 2029. Its advantage is that it's very small, so it's very easy to integrate. But of course, for that process to be complete, there is a lot of legislation that needs to be adapted, a lot of reforms that are ongoing, particularly the reform of the judiciary. But we have seen some positive results recently, some very visible, important corruption scandals being resolved with prison sentences, something that Moldovans haven't seen in a while.
And in terms of that election that you mentioned, the EU playing a big role in it, how are Moldovans feeling? What are the sort of main issues that are running up against the candidates?
So one of the main challenges is the cost of living crisis. And this is all over the world, I guess, all over Europe. But in Moldova, prices are really high, partly because we're such a small country and economies of scale do not help us. And we used to be dependent on Russian gas for 30 years. And it's only in the past few years that we've moved away from that. And actually, just a few days ago, we had one day when all of our energy came from renewables, which was a premiere for Moldova. So people are thinking about the cost of living, and the European kind of direction is very important to a lot of people. But at the same time, there is also frustration with the mistakes and the kind of arrogance of some of the members of the leading party. So that will play against PAS.
The Transnistria conflict, as mentioned, is often called frozen. Have there been any recent developments there in the run-up to this election by way of any kind of interference?
There is always something going on in Transnistria. I wouldn't call it a civil war. I would call it a Russian-Moldovan war. It's it's basically Russia's first invasion of a former colony after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we have been living with those consequences until now. There is talk surrounding the use of Moldovan citizens in Transnistria for Russian kind of interference purposes for these protests where they get paid and organized and kind of transported to the capital city. But also there are worries to do with rigging the vote. Basically, people in Transnistria have been served Russian propaganda for 30 years. It's an authoritarian kind of regime that controls it de facto, although internationally the statelet is not recognized, not even by Russia. But the fact that people have been served this Russian propaganda for decades means that their allegiance to the kind of Moldovan state is far lower. And also they are a lot poorer. They have a monopoly there that has basically taken all of the money into its claws, and a lot of people from Transnistria commute to Chisinau and other places in Moldova because the wages here are higher than there.
Well, Paula Irizanu, Moldovan Romanian journalist in Chisinau, thank you very much. This is The Globalist. It's 16:09 in Canberra and 7:09 here in London. Australia has taken the extraordinary step of suspending diplomatic ties with Iran, expelling Tehran's ambassador in Canberra and shutting down its embassy in Tehran. It's the first time since the Second World War that Australia has expelled a foreign ambassador. The move follows accusations that Iran's Revolutionary Guard was behind arson attacks targeting Jewish sites in Sydney and Melbourne last year. Iran has angrily rejected the allegations and vowed to retaliate. We're joined in the studio now by Latika Book, writer-at-large for the Australian publication The Nightly. Latika, always good to have you with us. Firstly, can you tell us a bit more about these incidents and how they affected community relations at home?
Yes, since October 7, there have been a growing spate of anti-Semitic incidents and attacks in this particular case across Australia. And this has been very perplexing, and it's also become a hot political issue. Because growing up in Australia, there was never really an anti-Semitic vibe, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Anti-Semitism is not something that's very prevalent in Australia and never has been. There's a very strong Jewish community because Australia took in a lot of refugees after the Second World War, and by and large they've been very overwhelmingly welcomed and integrated into the community, and nothing much more has been thought about it until October 7. We have seen increasing demonstrations that have verged into anti-Semitism in Australia, much like some of the same protests and some of the dynamics you see in, say, London, in Paris, or in the United States. But where it really crossed into something more was we started having attacks on Jewish sites themselves. And last year there were two in particular that were quite prominent. There was a firebombing of a Jewish synagogue in Melbourne. Nobody was hurt. It happened in the middle of the night. And we had Jewish childcare centres, for example, being attacked. There was a lot of graffiti across some of these Jewish sites. And then there was another firebomb attack on a kosher kitchen in Sydney. And this is obviously highly dangerous because this is firebombing, this is violence. This is not just words said on the street, and this is not just graffiti outside a Jewish building, as terrible as those two things are. So there was some suggestion last year that this was foreign interference. Yesterday came the stunning admission from the Australian government that ASIO, the spy agency, had concluded that at least two of those attacks, and in particular the firebombing attacks on the synagogue and the kitchen in Sydney, or the cafe in Sydney, were orchestrated, were sponsored and funded by Iran. This is huge. This is beyond foreign interference. This is violence being committed on Australian soil. And that's what has led to the expulsion of the Iranian ambassador this week.
And did they provide much intelligence publicly on this? And why Australia, of all countries, to carry this out?
Good questions. No, we have had a few more details. ASIO's spy boss, Mike Burgess is his name, he has said that he thinks that at least two, they have concluded that at least two of these attacks were carried out by Iran or on Iranian instruction or under Iranian funding. But there could be more. Not all, but there could be more. We have, through the government, subsequently learned that they have been able to track a lot of this through crypto. So to be clear, it wasn't Iranian agents on the ground in Australia. What the Iranians were doing were funding local criminal gangs who didn't necessarily know that they were actually working for the Iranian government.
Something we've seen the Russians do here in the UK against Ukrainian targets.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is the same playbook. And the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, referred to them as cutout criminals. So they're basically operating for whoever's paying them via crypto and not really realising that they were doing the work of a foreign government. Why Australia? That's also a good question. The Australian government says this is an attempt to sow discord, disharmony, and there has been a lot of this in Australia, as we have seen across Western governments. The war in Gaza has deeply divided communities, and it is leading to a lot of political pressure on the government. But what's really interesting about this instance is that a year ago, the opposition were calling for the government to expel the ambassador after he was writing on social media very anti-Semitic things about Jews, about Israel. And the government said at the time, well, these are words. They called him in for a summons but did not expel him. as part of this, the Australian government is also now going to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, bringing it into line with the United States and Canada. That's something that many in Australia have been urging the government to do, and the government has resisted until this week. Now it says it will change the law to allow that organisation to be listed as a terror grouping. So there's a lot of politics at play here.
Big steps for Prime Minister Albanese's government. What's the reaction been like amongst the sort of political parties, but also just generally Australians?
This is quite perplexing. So there's been an overwhelming, I think, support for this. It's bipartisan, obviously. The opposition, which has been asking for this for a year, is obviously very happy that this move has come, although there's many who say that it's too late. The government, in defence, says, this crossed a line. Violent attacks are different to words on Twitter, and this is why we've taken this radical action. What has been interesting is some of the far right, and this is online, I would say, some of the left blogosphere and such, they're doubting the intelligence agencies. And they are saying, why would Iran do something that would garner sympathy for Israel? It must be someone else, i.e. wink, wink, nudge, nudge, it must be Israel. Now, that's a very interesting dynamic for the Labor government in Australia to have to contend with. And we saw today the Prime Minister come out and say, I hope that this actually gives the Australian public community confidence in the intelligence agencies. But by and large, I think that's a very small segment of an adverse reaction. Mostly this has been very much endorsed.
And just finally, I mean, relations between Canberra and Tel Aviv have been strained since October 7th, sort of more particularly in recent months. But Israel has welcomed this decision. What does it mean for sort of Australia's foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East now?
Australia has fallen into line with France, the UK, and recognised recently the state of Palestine for as much as that exists. Now, that's angered Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who went on television and called the Prime Minister a weak leader and really berated him. That's completely counterproductive. Benjamin Netanyahu is not a leader that the Australian public see as somebody who they're going to take moral guidance from. If anything, they see the destruction in Gaza as something that has, if not delegitimised Benjamin Netanyahu as a Prime Minister, is on the verge of actually losing public support for the state of Israel. So that's been completely, I would say, an own goal, what Israel has done in response to Australia's move. But yes, there is a deterioration of Australia's relationship with Israel that's upset the local Jewish community in Australia. And it also does just increase this widening between Australia and its most traditional and firmest ally, security ally, the United States, which of course is backing Benjamin Netanyahu for now. But that is not Australia out on its own there. That's Australia out with, I would say, the bulk of the European governments.
And the rest of Five Eyes, essentially.
Exactly. And it puts, I think, the US and Israel are separate to the rest.
Latika Burke, we'll talk lots more about this. You're a writer at large at the Australian publication The Nightly. Thank you so much for coming in. Still to come in the programme.
The Faroese capital, Tórshavn, is now within easy commuting distance to all of the archipelago's 17 inhabited islands, while smaller villages are accessible to new residents and visitors, breathing life and money into once isolated communities.
We learn how the Faroe Islands have succeeded in stopping young people from leaving the islands for good. This is The Globalist.
Craft is its own reward, which is why at UBS we're honoured to work alongside over 50 of today's leading Nobel laureates, each an expert in the art of economic science, bringing you engaging discussions, actionable insights, and inspired solutions, all focused around the questions that shape our world today. For a better outlook, find a Nobel perspective. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And I'm pleased to say joining me in the studio is Terry Stiastny, political journalist and author of Believable Lies, The Misfits Who Fought Churchill's Secret Propaganda War. Terry, you're taking us over the channel first.
Yes, that's right. Well, I'm sort of taking kind of the interaction between British politics and French politics, focusing on the channel, because on the front page of The Times this morning, it says Labour bid to head off small boats hits trouble. And what they are suggesting is that because there is something of a political crisis in France at the moment, and this morning, Macron is getting all of his Council of Ministers to meet, discussing this no confidence vote that is going to happen in France on the 8th of September. And in Britain, where this issue of small boats crossing the Channel has been the biggest political issue probably of the last week or so, certainly, the government seems to be concerned about what the French political chaos might mean for their plans to try to stop these boats, because the French government said back in February that they would change the law so that French officials were able to intercept boats crossing the Channel. And now, according to The Times, the UK government sources are saying the political situation in France is difficult. We still hope they will operationalise the change to French law, but it's become more difficult due to these developments. Some other government sources suggesting that they still think the French change in the law might go ahead, but obviously everything is slightly up in the air at the moment.
Because we have seen incidences now of French police using knives to slash boats as they're launching. Keir Starmer announced this big one-in, one-out plan, so anyone that crosses from France will be swapped for someone in France who is trying to claim asylum, to try and stop just this sort of deadly trade across the Channel, which is, tens of thousands of people every year, highly risky. It's sort of the main, increasingly dominant issue in British politics. Nigel Farage yesterday unveiling big plans. Even if you've watched the new Netflix hostage drama with, which is about the Prime Minister's husband, fictional husband, getting kidnapped, it's a part of the background as the Channel migrant crisis. So this really is the big problem for Labour, isn't it?
It really is, and particularly given that, as you say, Nigel Farage, yesterday he was doing big press conferences talking about his ideas of having, mass deportations, having all sorts of drastic schemes. The government's main response to this in the UK so far has to be saying, well, look, we're going to do deals with other countries such as France. We are going to be able to send people back, have this one-in, one-out scheme. We can do this on a legal basis and through discussions with other countries. But when, Farage is then able to sort of step up and say, I would do all sorts of drastic things, rip up international treaties, rip up international law, and the French government is saying, well, we need to look at this, we need to look at the legality about international maritime law, it makes it harder for the British government to say that we are actually tackling this problem.
And shifting now to Ukraine, a story in the FT about the US offering air and intelligence support to post-war forces in the country.
Yes, this is right. This is leading the Financial Times this morning, and it seems to be a bit of a shift in the US position. European officials and Ukrainian officials have told the Financial Times that the US has said it will provide intelligence assets and battlefield oversights to any Western security plan. So this is talking about potentially a post-war Ukraine, the idea of having some kind of European troops on the ground. But European officials sort of suggesting that they think that this is actually quite an interesting shift from the United States because, there's been a whole discussion, obviously, about what would the nature of US guarantees to Ukraine be. And European officials suggesting this is quite a significant shift in stance from the Trump administration, and the Europeans actually feel that they're getting somewhere, though, of course, with the sort of proviso that, things that come from the Trump administration can change back again always as quickly as they started.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It sort of flips, and one of the headlines we've got today, of course, is that India is suffering this additional now secondary sanction from its dealings with Russia, the fact it buys oil and weapons from the country, and it's now being punished. We had that flurry of diplomatic activity, the meeting in Alaska, then European leaders flying out for that meeting at the White House. But, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's really getting anywhere soon. And we know Donald Trump likes a quick and easy win. He's desperate for the Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think that this is another sign that he's sort of turning more back towards the European position away from Putin?
Well, yeah, I think it does seem to be sort of some grounds for cautious optimism, I suppose, in that the Ukraine is suggesting that, the US is suggesting that they would actually offer quite a lot more in terms of aircraft, logistics, support. But of course, the question would be, are European countries prepared to have forces on the ground in Ukraine? And do they think that those guarantees are strong enough not to put European troops at risk? And of course, before you get to any of that, you've got to have a ceasefire and some sort of peace deal with a prospect of holding. And
I mean, Ukraine is an EU member candidate. Every time Ursula von der Leyen speaks on the matter, she says the application is still ongoing. There has also been, for decades, but more seriously in the last few years, talk of some kind of EU force, EU army. Is this the kind of incident that really could force Brussels' hand in coming up with some kind of, combined EU army that sort of deploys to the country as a sort of barrier defence?
Well, I think, I suppose the question is, would this be EU-led, or would this be more likely to be sort of NATO, under the auspices of NATO, but essentially run by Europe? And, how much would people support this? How much would people back putting troops into Ukraine from European countries, potentially sort of open-ended? Everybody is saying, yes, we've got to spend more on defence, but when it actually comes to saying we would send, there's talking here about possibly 4 to 5 European brigades on the ground provided by the coalition. How much support is there going to be politically for that, and for how long?
Well, turning to much lighter affairs now. The caption, it's on an Instagram post that might soon be the most liked in history on the platform. Your English teacher and your gym teacher are getting married. This is, of course, superstar Taylor Swift and NFL player Travis Kelce. They are set to get hitched. They are. And if you look at pretty much, apart from the Financial Times, not surprisingly, but pretty much every other UK front page this morning has got this picture from Taylor Swift Instagram account of the couple there. And, it's just amazing. And looking at the reporting of this in The Guardian, obviously, it's a big story. They're big superstars. But just how much the impact this has in terms of brands and money. And, obviously, Taylor Swift is a sort of a master of PR as well as of selling records and concerts and everything else. But just, how things sell out. So it's her dress. She was wearing a striped, sort of black and white striped sundress, apparently $400. Very classic style.
Very sort of girl next door-y kind of thing, I would say. $400, and it sold out in 20 minutes after people looked at the picture, identified what dress this was, and, people went out and bought it so that they could have a similar thing. It's all very staged with the big flowers behind, and everybody's looking at her ring, which apparently people estimating the ring cost $500,000.
Wow.
Possibly.
And I was really struck by this, actually, and I'm surprised the Financial Times hasn't gone on it, because a lot of companies very quickly seem to have had a plan in place for this contingency, because within minutes you had the likes of, as The Guardian says, Walmart, Olive Green, DoorDash, here in the UK, Marks and Spencer's. They all had it felt like pre-prepared sort of posts sort of trying to cash in on this. Marks and Spencer's here offering up, Colin the Caterpillar cakes for the wedding cake. So this is sort of a cultural moment. I mean, we say we're not in a uni culture anymore. Everyone is so sort of atomized. But this is someone who actually, after the Eras tour, is at sort of a Michael Jackson level of international fame.
Well, as you say, I mean, it is potentially a Financial Times story. I mean, when Taylor Swift goes on tour, that you've seen bumps to whole countries' GDPs because of the amount of money that people spend going to the concerts, staying in hotels, spending on entertainment and whatever. But I do wonder, did the brands, as you say, did they have this all planned, or did suddenly everybody go, quick emergency meeting? How are we going to respond to the Taylor Swift engagement story? And does it sell you more, more Krispy Kreme donuts? Does it sell you more, Colin the Caterpillar cakes? I don't know. Perhaps it does. Perhaps, the impact of Taylor Swift is so huge that, that she has this big economic impact.
Yeah, definitely. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because I noticed that even the royal family here in the UK, so the account of Kate and Wills, liked the post. So, I mean, this is for America now a bit of a fairy tale story. Well, Terry Jasny, political journalist and author, thank you very much. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump's steep 50% tariffs on India have kicked in weeks after the US president issued an executive order hitting the country with an additional 25% penalty over its purchase of Russian oil and weapons. This makes India one of the US's strongest partners in the Indo-Pacific, among the countries paying the highest tariffs in the world. SpaceX has pulled off a successful 60-minute test flight of its newest generation rocket, Starship, reversing a trend of disappointing failures. NASA plans to use Starship to send humans to the moon for its ambitious Artemis program in 2027. The animated musical K-pop Demon Hunters has climbed up Netflix's charts to become its most viewed movie ever, the streaming platform says. Since its low-key release in June, the film has been watched more than 236 million times, with its songs now riding high in the global charts. And after 2 years of dating, superstar Taylor Swift and NFL player Travis Kelce have announced their engagement. The couple's Instagram post is on its way to being the most liked ever on the platform. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now for a look behind the headlines, here's Joseph Phelan on how the Faroe Islands managed to reverse its brain drain.
There's a question that sooner or later confronts those who grow up in a small community. Do I stay or do I go? The overwhelming number of people across Europe that stump for the latter are leaving large swathes of some countries completely hollowed out. Latvia has lost a third of its population in 3 decades. Bulgaria is on track to lose a fifth of its people by 2050, and some areas of the Scottish Highlands are now even emptier than Lapland. It's a challenge that's far easier to acknowledge than to address. How do you create an environment that doesn't just keep people in, but draws back those who've already left? The Faroe Islands, a self-governing Danish territory of 18 islands and about 55,000 people in the North Atlantic, could provide an answer. 2 decades ago, the islands were grappling with steady depopulation. Between 2004 and 2013, more than 2,700 residents under the age of 40 left the Faroes. As in so many peripheral regions, young people sought education and opportunity abroad without a reason to return. Yet, by 2022, that trend had not only reversed, but swung back dramatically. The number of under 40s rose by 3,000 in just 9 years. A youth boom that's left the Faroes at the median age of 37.1, making it demographically younger than any country in the EU. So how did they do it? The first step was to enhance connectivity. Building world-class undersea tunnels has made opportunity a two-way street. The Faroese capital, Tórshavn, is now within easy commuting distance to all of the archipelago's 17 inhabited islands, while smaller villages are accessible to new residents and visitors, breathing life and money into once isolated communities. Alongside this, record-breaking 5G speeds, amongst the fastest in Europe, make remote working feasible even from the most blustery headland. Coupled with ambitious pro-family funding, a year of paid leave, heavily subsidised childcare and affordable housing, the Faroes have substantially eased the economic pressures that often drive people to bigger foreign cities. The final element, which is less tangible but equally crucial, is a cultural shift. The islands have a self-assurance that's seen them step decisively out of their Danish shadow. While local pride's always been strong, over 90% speak Faroese as a first language, it's now far more visible. On store shelves and in pubs, local beer, whiskey and even soft drinks regularly outsell global brands. When citizens see ambitious subsea projects being built, generous support for families and investment in local enterprise, it all adds up to a society that backs itself. The Faroes' transformation is remarkable, but it raises questions about whether such success can be replicated. Its circumstances are hard to ignore. It's small, socially cohesive and wealthy, with a GDP per capita of €61,800, that's double the EU average. The economy also leans heavily on fishing rights and subsidies from Denmark, providing access to the bloc's markets and research funding. But these are advantages, not magic bullets. Young Faroese once packed their bags for the same reason as their European peers, a shortage of opportunity. Perhaps the Faroes' most striking success marker is that it makes no attempt to keep its young people at home. Instead, they're encouraged to gain experience abroad, confident that most will return. For communities everywhere, the question isn't whether they can replicate the Faroese model. It's how they can apply its core principle, creating a place so strong in identity and opportunity that it trusts its people to come back once they've exercised their wanderlust.
That was Joseph Phelan. For more, you can sign up to our daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute. Head over to monocle.com/minute. This is The Globalist. It's 7:34 here in London and 8:34 in Warsaw, where in a dramatic move, Poland's newly installed president, Karol Nawrocki, has vetoed a government proposal to extend support for Ukrainian refugees. The decision means key funding will dry up, and among the consequences, Poland will no longer cover Ukraine's Starlink satellite subscription from October 1st, a service that has been vital for Kyiv's communications throughout the war. Well, we're joined now by Mateusz Mazzini, writer-at-large at Gazeta Wyborcza, a lecturer and also a lecturer in journalism at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. Mateusz, does this veto put Poland's future support for Ukraine in doubt at a time when Allied backing is still critical?
Very much so, although I think it's fundamental to clarify that this is more a spat within the Polish domestic politics rather than a move aimed directly at weakening Ukraine's defense. You know, Vinny, from the outset, it looked like a technicality, and sure, Donald Tusk's government was hoping for it to remain a technicality, because for the last 3.5 years, Ukrainian refugees working and living in Poland were allowed to receive social security benefits and all sorts of government protection, including the legal one, on the basis of a very special bill that was passed immediately after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia into the Ukrainian territory. That bill expires at the end of September. And the government has tabled sort of an automatic extension of that bill that covers social security, covers legal protection, access to school, other public services, but also covers the costs of the Ukrainian Starlink subscription to the tune of $50 million per year paid by the Polish government. Karol Nawrocki decided to veto that amendment, that extension of the special bill on Monday, citing, and I quote, that the socio-economic conditions have changed, which is just a euphemistic way of saying that Poland perhaps needs to scale back its financial and political support to Ukraine after 3.5 years of war, which is obviously a nod to his own electorate, mostly the far-right Ukraine skeptic, Eurosceptic electorate that pushed him through in the second round of the presidential ballot. This is not to say that there will be no more Polish support to Ukraine, because Nawrocki, in a very clever political move, has tabled his own extension to that bill, but with some very controversial provisions, including making some symbols of the Ukrainian nationalism equal to symbols of Nazism and communism. So technically, the parliament can pass this amendment and extend Polish cover for the Ukrainian Starlink subscription, but that would be a major defeat for the government.
So, I mean, does this show a wider shift in Polish attitudes towards Ukraine after nearly 3 years of war? Or is this simply the new president trying to come in and assert some authority and try and sort of differentiate himself from Donald Tusk's government?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. We need to remember, we spoke about that here on air quite a few times already. Nawrocki is a far-right politician. He might be a political newcomer. He might not be widely recognized or known in Europe, but he is really a radical politician that has staunchly anti-Ukrainian views on many aspects, including historical policy, which is obviously a contentious issue in bilateral relations between Kyiv and Warsaw. So he will be way more anti-Ukrainian than his predecessor, Andrzej Duda. And given the fact that Tusk's government remains a very strong ally of Kyiv, committed to the Ukrainian cause, this will cause a lot of tension. So I think a little bit this is, in fact, as you said, a move by Nawrocki to assert his own position, but also it puts Donald Tusk's cabinet in a very difficult position because there is no good solution. There's no way out of avoiding a crisis in this moment, because if the parliament, if the ruling majority doesn't pass the law, Ukraine loses the cover of its Starlink subscription, which is not just about front lines, it's not just about defenses. Poland provides storage, safe storage, to Ukrainian administration's data, protecting it from Russian cyber attacks. So this is fundamental for the day-to-day functioning of the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people who remain in Ukraine, not just those who are in Poland. So if Tusk doesn't order the ruling majority in the parliament to pass this, then the diplomatic capital built and accumulated by Poland as main ally of Ukraine for the last 3.5 years will be squandered. But if they pass that obviously gives...
Yes, I'm afraid, Maciej Mazzini, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, President Trump has threatened retaliatory tariffs against countries whose taxes on regulations, he says, target US tech companies. He didn't name specific nations, but his warning is likely directed at the UK and the European Union, both of which have been pursuing landmark digital rules and taxes that affect these US platforms. The EU has insisted it will still press ahead with its Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, while the UK continues to collect its digital services tax. We're joined now by Isabel Hamilton, UK tech editor at Politico. Isabel, can you explain what Trump is threatening and which countries are likely to be affected by these tariffs?
Well, in classic Trump style, it's not entirely clear. He has threatened additional tariffs and restrictions on exports on things like chips. And yes, this would be mostly targeted at the EU, I would say. And the timing of it is particularly interesting because it's coming days after the ink has dried on Trump and the EU's sort of tariff truce. And the EU was very proud of the fact that they had kept digital regulation out of that conversation. They were boasting about it just days ago. And now he's kind of come in with this bombshell and threatened to tear up the whole thing.
And the EU has said it will still move ahead with its digital rules despite this warning. But how might these tariffs sort of exacerbate tensions between the US and the EU?
Well, when the EU and the US agreed their tariff truce, it was seen as a bit of a climb down on the EU side. It was perceived that the EU had sort of capitulated a bit just because they were so desperate for the US to continue supporting Ukraine. When it comes to trying to influence EU regulation, though, when it comes to trying to influence enforcement of their laws, they've signalled that they're going to take a stronger stance. And before they arrived at their truce, the EU was talking about sort of anti-coercive measures and something that's nicknamed the trade bazooka, which would see potentially tariffs imposed on US goods, sort of 93 billion euros was what was being kicked around before they managed to come to an agreement. And also potentially sanctions on things like even intellectual property laws. It could really bust out a very wide toolkit if it decides to go back into the fray.
And in terms of the UK, which has got its sort of new, Online Safety Act, and it's sort of slightly further ahead than the EU on this, what impact could it have here?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the UK is further ahead than the EU. The EU's got the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. It's quite hard to know what we're going to do here. We have taken less of a hardline stance in negotiations with the US than the EU has done, as Trump has been rolling out these kind of big tariff announcements. What Number 10 said yesterday is that it's important that we continue enforcing the Online Safety Act, but it also stressed that we've got a constructive relationship with the US and that we'll continue to talk to them about any issues. So they've slightly left the door open. On the digital services tax, we've got a 2% tax that's been in place since 2020. They said that the Chancellor has previously said we'll always make sure businesses pay their fair share of tax, including in the digital sector, and there's no change there. Of course, what fair share constitutes is something that's quite flexible.
And, I mean, how much has this been influenced by those sort of titans of Silicon Valley who we've seen have hugged Trump close in the second term, even appearing behind him at his inauguration?
It's really difficult to know because they've definitely wiggled closer to power this time around compared to the first administration. But I think what kind of gets forgotten in this conversation, where Trump is sort of lobbying really hard to try and scrap digital regulations abroad, is that they're not being treated with the same sort of genteelness back home in the US. You know, Trump hasn't intervened, for example, in court cases against Meta. I think there's a version of this story where digital regulations are sort of a stick that Trump can hit people on the other side of negotiations with, rather than him genuinely believing and being on the side of big tech companies.
Isabel Hamilton, UK tech editor at Politico, thank you very much. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
With UBS, you have a truly global partner, incorporating new technologies, innovative approaches, and unexpected opportunities, leading you to insights that help answer the questions that matter, delivered with passion, care, and unmatched expertise. Because it's about rising with the dawn each day, knowing that we can do even better. That's what banking is to us. Not just work, but a craft. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Time now for a look at news from the world of aviation, and for that we're joined from Brighton, a seaside town you will have likely flown over on approach to London's Gatwick Airport, by Murdo Morrison, Head of Strategic Content at Flight Global. Murdo, good to have you with us. It's been a rocky few years for Boeing, but they've just landed a big order.
Yes, they have, from Korean Air, and I think partly helped by President Trump's tariff diplomacy. It came just after the South Korean president met with Trump in the White House for 103 Boeing aircraft. Now, Boeing has really been in crisis since 2019, when the MAX narrowbody was grounded after these two crashes. And then that was followed by COVID, of course, and all sorts of management mishaps that have really seen, one of the world's two big airliner manufacturers really, probably too big to fail, but hemorrhaging money and just accumulating problem upon problem. Things have started to turn around under the new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, who joined a year ago. Part of that is probably his skill as a CEO. Part of it's just good fortune. Part of it's just that things are starting to fall into place. Quite significantly, Boeing had, since the grounding of the MAX, 450 737s sitting in desert airfields because there were no customers for them. The last of these has now been flown away. So that's quite a symbolic milestone, really, for Boeing's recovery. But they've still got many, many problems. They've still got a supply chain that's in trouble, including one of their biggest suppliers, Spirit Aerosystems, that they've been forced to take over, to acquire. It's losing lots of money. All their debts will end up with Boeing. They've got problems with programs that are delayed, including the 737 MAX 10, which is their sort of stretch narrow body that competes with the Airbus's sort of long-range narrow body, the A321 XLR, and that's sort of narrow body that can fly across the Atlantic. Their flagship, the 777-9, it's been delayed for years and years and years. It's expected now next year, but all sorts of problems still on Kelly Ortberg's, that he's having to deal with.
And turning now to the UK Supreme Court, it's issued a significant ruling regarding Russian-owned business jets.
Yes, there has been. If you've ever been to Farnborough Airport and you are a bit of an aircraft spotter, you might have spotted this Bombardier Global 6500. That's one of Bombardier's big world-crossing business jets, luxury business jets, that's been sitting there since March 2022. The reason is that it belongs to a Russian oligarch called Eugene Shvidler, who's a British citizen, but was born in Russia. He's an associate of Roman Abramovich, who you'll remember was forced to sell Chelsea Football Club for the same reason. The Supreme Court in the UK has just ruled that the government has a right to continue impounding that aircraft. Schwidler has claimed that it's sort of disproportionately affecting his private life and property rights, not having access to this aircraft. But the Supreme Court has ruled that the British government, as part of its overall sanctions policy on Russia and people associated with the Kremlin regime, has got every right to continue impounding that aircraft.
And just finally, Lilium, once flagship European eVTOL startup, but now facing possible takeover after financial troubles. What's gone wrong?
Yes, Lilium has been, it's one of probably three European-based eVTOL developers out of probably a dozen in the world who are developing these electric vertical takeoff air taxis. There are probably, when I say there's about a dozen, that's probably 10 too many for what the market will eventually be able to support. But Lilium had quite a sort of unusual design. It was a sort of a jet with small diameter fans on each wing, but they've struggled. They went into administration late last year. They stopped manufacturing completely, or stopped the business, shuttered in February. Since then, there have been attempts to take over the company, which would effectively be just simply taking over the IP that the company still has for this electric air taxi. Whether it will ever get built, I think, is sort of is dubious. But attempts are still continuing, and there is still potentially life in Lilium.
Well, Murdo Morrison, Head of Strategic Content at Flight Global, thank you very much. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. It's 14:51 in Kuala Lumpur and 7:51 here in London. Malaysia launched the southern section of its 1,000-kilometre north-south electric train service on Saturday, completing a railway network from the Thai border to Singapore. King Sultan Ibrahim personally drove the inaugural train from Kuala Lumpur to Kluang to mark the launch. The new service reduces cross-country travel by half, with trains operating at speeds of up to 140 kilometres per hour. I'm joined now by Hadi Azmi, in Kuala Lumpur-based journalist. Hadi, good to have you on the programme. So what exactly is Malaysia's new train service like?
Yeah, so basically the new train service is an upgrade to our 100-year-old tracks, which has been around for a long time. So the service is much faster, more comfortable, and a lot more people are excited to get on the trains now because our roads has gotten too congested. So yeah, it's quite interesting for the whole country.
And why has the government launched this new service? What was the justification for the investment?
Well, basically, the government realized that trains are actually great. We sort of sidelined our train service for quite a few decades because we were focused on our highways and all our roads. But, as those gets more congested, the government realized that, we actually have this expensive train network that could be improved, and they went on and did that.
And now that the operations have actually begun, what's been the reaction in Malaysia? Has there been a flurry of bookings?
Yeah, I mean, the open bookings over the weekends, and train is supposed to start in a few days. A lot of people have expressed their interest in taking the trains. A lot of small towns along the route are excited for the prospect of local tourism. All over the country, people are talking about it.
And Malaysia is, a huge tourist destination in the region. What will this train do to change the way tourists might want to explore the country? Does it sort of, unlock kind of new areas or by way of its sort of route, does it sort of mean that it potentially is kind of creating a kind of new route through the sort of corner?
Yeah, definitely. It connects all the major towns. It connects Kuala Lumpur, it connects Penang, it connects to the Singapore and Thai border. But it also opens up all these smaller towns in between that has a lot of potential, especially in terms of ecotourism. A lot of these small towns have nature reserves close to them. So there's a lot of potential that could be exploited there.
Hadi Azmi, thank you very much. Now, we've talked a lot today about conflict, but how can the instruments of war be repurposed to represent peace? For French-born American artist Armand Fernandez, surplus weaponry was the perfect building block for a monument to peace. Here, Noor Amelia Hilda takes us to the Lebanese capital of Beirut to visit the Hope for Peace monument.
On the outskirts of Beirut, in the town of Yarzeh, where the headquarters of the Lebanese Ministry of Defense is located, stands an unusual concrete monolith constructed using real weapons of war. Ironically, this 30-meter structure is named the Hope for Peace Monument, or as it's otherwise known by locals, simply as the Tank Monument. Resembling a shelled building that has been ravished by war, the 10-story pyramid-like structure is embedded with over 78 decommissioned instruments of warfare, from Sherman Fireflies to Soviet-era T-55 tanks and other varieties of armored cars. Their cannons seem to protrude from the hollowed-out sections of the tower, ominously positioned to suggest they are aiming at an enemy target. The artist behind this unusual structure is the French-born American artist and sculptor Armand Fernandez, or just Armand, as he's better known in the art circles. The monument was built to commemorate the end of the civil war in Lebanon in 1990, a conflict that went on for 15 years and caused the deaths of about 150,000 people and displaced over 800,000 people from their homes. It may sound unusual to design a peace memorial using the very weapons that caused so much devastation, but according to the artist, by embedding the weaponry into concrete, it eradicates their original function, rendering these weapons of war forever still and silent. This was what Armand suggested to the crowd of spectators during the monument's unveiling ceremony in 1995, which also coincided with the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Lebanese army. The artist also expressed his hopes on how the monument should make people think twice before attacking a country that has endured so much devastation, and to see this brutal structure of silent tanks and weapons as a means for reconciliation. While the Hope for Peace monument found a fitting home in Lebanon, interestingly, it was not the first place that Armand had pitched the design concept to. In the early 1970s, he approached Strasbourg, suggesting that the monument be commemorated for the city's D-Day anniversary. Almost a decade later, Armand approached Israel in 1983, just a year after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. None of them, however, took up the offer, most likely due to the high cost and baffling logistics of constructing such a structure. It was only later in the 90s, while Armand was in Beirut working on the repairs for the city's war-damaged museum, that he found out that the Lebanese were looking to commission an artist to create a monument to express the country's hope for peace. With the surplus of weaponry available, some of which was confiscated from militia groups after the end of the civil war, the Lebanese army willingly provided the materials needed. With the help of the army and local construction companies, Armand set out to build the 5,000-ton monument in a span of 5 months. Every piece of machinery was hoisted into the structure and welded into place in the metal foundation. Concrete and sandbags were then used to keep them in place. Once the foundation was set, rusty parts were given a fresh coat of camouflage paint. Today, the monument is hard to miss when you're traveling on the Beirut-Damascus highway, but being in a security-focused zone is rarely visited, and taking pictures during visits is forbidden. While the structure is still intact, the Hope for Peace monument today is nothing more than just a silent witness to a country where peace remains hopeful.
That was Noor Amelia Hilda in Beirut. For more stories like this, why not tune into The Urbanist on Monocle Radio? Well, that is all for today's programme. Thank you to our producers Monica Lillis, Chris Chermak and Ryuma Takahashi in Tokyo, our researcher Henry King, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Elliot Greenfield. I'm Vincent McAviney. Thank you for listening. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow.